Hello and welcome to another award-winning episode of Stand Up with Pete Dominick, where I've got your daily news analysis, and today, two great guests on the show. Going old school, used to do it every day, so I'm dialing it back for you, and it's Bill Boyle and Eric Segall, both joining me, two regulars, two of your favorites. One, a constitutional law scholar and expert on all things Supreme Court, and a very opinionated good friend of mine. Another, well, a parking garage owner whose opinion we really respect on a lot of things. Bill Boyle and Eric Segall join me today. You can skip ahead. Eric starts at 23 minutes in. And then my conversation with Boyle begins at 49 minutes in. Both really great, insightful, and we cover a lot. I think you'll get a lot out of both of these conversations. Great perspectives from both Boyle and Segall on today's show. I hope you had a good weekend. I sure did. Very busy. Saw my high school buddies on Friday at a place we rented for the day, and then I ran back to New York City where I warmed up the audience for John Oliver's last week tonight. I highly recommend you watch it if you haven't yet. Airs, of course, on Sunday, posts on YouTube on Thursday, but he takes on British Parliament and everything that's happening over there, which I also talk with Boyle about today. Really interesting stuff. And then on Sunday, I drove upstate where I am now with my daughters for just a couple days to see my mom and dad, their grandparents, for a couple days in upstate New York. Hopefully get to see Kevin Richburg and get to enjoy this beautiful, beautiful part of our country where the weather is finally broken, and that's where I will get to the news, because we will start with the fact that it has been hot. Did you know? Have you talked to anybody? Have you been outside? All over the country and frankly all over the world. Let's get to that news right now. Apparently over 1,300 people died in this year's Hajj pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia as the faithful faced extreme high temperatures at Islamic holy sites in the Desert Kingdom, according to Saudi authorities on Sunday. 83% of the over 1,300 fatalities were unauthorized pilgrims who walked long distances in soaring temperatures to perform the rituals in and around the city of Mecca. And there's not apparently a lot of news coming out of it. They included more than 660 Egyptians, all but 31 of them were unauthorized pilgrims, whatever that means. I guess you have to register to be a part of the Hajj. I have no idea. It's just horrible what has happened there. And man, I just can't imagine this blistering heat wave, and then you're on this pilgrimage as well. Anyway, well, the heat wave stretched to a fifth day in the U.S. Nearly a third of the country was under hot weather advisories. Forecasters have predicted it's going to start to cool early this week, and it certainly will be where I am, just outside Syracuse in central New York. So looking forward to that break in this extreme weather that we've been dealing with. Speaking of extremes, let's get to the Supreme Court. I'll talk about it with Segall, but of course, you probably heard that on Friday, the Supreme Court ruled the government can actually take guns away from domestic abusers. The 8-1 ruling broke a years-long streak of major decisions expanding gun rights. So that's a good one. What else do I have for you? Oh, how about this? Democrats in California have agreed to delay a minimum wage increase for about 426,000 healthcare workers to help balance the state's budget. The agreement between Governor Gavin Newsom and legislative leaders is part of a larger plan to close an estimated $46.8 billion shortfall. But how did they get there? The second year in a row, the nation's most populous state has had a multi-billion-dollar deficit. Healthcare workers were supposed to get a raise July 1st, part of the plan to gradually increase their pay to $25 an hour over the next decade. But now, if approved by the legislature next week, they could get that raise in October, but only if California's revenues between July and September are at least 3% higher than what officials have estimated. So that's a pretty big story if you're going to be affected by that, one of those 426,000 healthcare workers that aren't getting that raise. Let's go to the Middle East, where Israeli airstrikes shook Gaza City. Israel said its jets struck Hamas military infrastructure. Gazan rescue workers and residents said there were many killed. On Sunday night in Israel, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the intensive phase of Israel's war against Hamas is about to end. In an interview on Israeli television, although he said he did not mean the conflict itself was coming to a close. After the operation in Rafah, Gaza's southernmost city and the latest focus of Israel's ground offensive, the Prime Minister said Israel would keep, quote, mowing the lawn, a term long used in Israeli security circles to denote the use of force aimed at curtailing the regrowth of militant organizations. And the UN agency that aids Palestinians said that 69% of school buildings where displaced families were seeking shelter in Gaza have sustained direct hits or damage. Israel's repeatedly targeted what it says are Hamas fighters located in school buildings and airstrikes that have also killed civilians. And finally, Benjamin Netanyahu doubled down on his complaints about the supply of U.S. munitions. I'll talk more about that with Bill Boyle in our conversation coming up. And now let's head to Russia, where gunmen attacked synagogues and churches in 2 cities in southern Russia on Sunday, killing multiple police officers and a priest in an apparently coordinated assault that underscored Russia's vulnerability to extremist violence. Officials said 6 of the gunmen were killed after shootouts in 2 cities in the predominantly Muslim region on the Caspian Sea. This is of Dagestan in Russia. So they were apparently wielding rifles and Molotov cocktails. They attacked a synagogue and a church in each of the 2 cities, according to authorities and religious organizations. And if I wanted to, I could fill the whole news segment with horrible shootings that are taking place across the country, all different kinds of violent gun violence, from suicide to domestic violence, gang violence, to, of course, the one that seems to strike terror in the fear of most people's hearts, unexplainable mass shootings in public places. And I don't say that much about it. It seems like it happens a lot over the weekends for some reasons. Obviously, it happens when it gets hotter and so on. But I do want to mention what happened in Arkansas, a grocery store where shoppers were minding their own business and some guy just walked in with a bunch of guns, apparently, and started shooting people. No motive has yet been found with this guy, but he fatally shot, I think, 5 people at this grocery store in Arkansas, a town roughly 3,700 people, 60 miles down south of downtown Little Rock, apparently. Dude had a 12-gauge, a pistol, and a bandolier of ammunition. He opened fire in the parking lot, then in the grocery store, then returned outside, exchanged gunfire with the police, who'd arrived apparently in 3 minutes after the call. The first 911 call came in, and they detained him within another 5 minutes, apparently. So that's the story out of Arkansas. I'm just reading this real quick, and I don't know why I mentioned it, but I thought this week I would include it. I don't want to ignore that these things happen, but I don't want to scare people more than they already are to live their lives without fear of this horrible and often very random violence. But there you have it in Arkansas, where we have a lot of listeners, and I'm sure you've been affected by it anytime it happens and you hear about it. So there's that. Here's a little better story. The state of Illinois is poised to right a 175-year-old wrong by returning land in northern Illinois guaranteed to a prairie-band Native American tribe, the Potawatomi Nation. Wow. 175 years after U.S. government stole land from the chief of the Potawatomi Nation while he was away visiting relatives, Illinois may return it to the tribe. To right the wrong, Illinois would apparently transfer a 1,500-acre state park west of Chicago, which was named after Shabana, the prairie-band Potawatomi Nation. The state would continue providing maintenance while the tribe says it would want to keep the park as is. So I thought that was a good story, and I'm hoping I get the credit and awards I deserve for the correct pronunciation of Potawatomi so many times. All right, well, you've got the presidential debate this week, the earliest one in American history. We'll see what happens. Any potential missteps could shape the race for weeks, some analysts are saying. I don't know what else they're saying. Trump, for his part, over the weekend, heightened his false inflammatory campaign messages to solicit donations everywhere, said all kinds of crazy shit I'm not really going to cover. I have a couple things I'll play for you because they're so bizarre. Columbia University placed 3 deans on leave over their conduct during a anti-Semitism panel. Leaked images showed them sharing disparaging messages, a lot of reporting on that. And it's the last full week of June and the first full week of summer. I just want to remind you where you are at. I'll be hosting a debate watch party. We'll start it at, I think, 7 p.m. on a Thursday night. Biden versus Trump, the rematch. That's coming up. Also coming up this week, the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich is standing trial on Wednesday on espionage charges, which are trumped up, obviously. Iranian presidential elections are this Friday. Voters are going to choose a successor to their last president who was killed last month in a helicopter crash. And the Tour de France begins this Saturday if you're interested in cycling and doping. Sorry, Tour fans. All right, now let's get to some of those sound clips I've got for you from the weekend. Let's start with this controversial one from he was on Fox News. I talked with Bill Boyle about it. But this is Ronnie Jackson, his congressman, former presidential doctor, I think committing a real ethical violation with what he's saying here by talking about and insinuating and accusing that the current president of the United States is on drugs and how he should be treated and how he should be tested. This is about 1 minute long from Earth 2 yesterday on Fox News.
And it's really embarrassing as a former White House physician to have to do something like this, but we don't have any choice based on what's going on. But I'm going to be demanding on behalf of many millions of concerned Americans right now that he submit to a drug test before and after this debate, specifically looking for performance-enhancing drugs. Because we've seen recently in his State of the Union address that there was a Joe Biden that came out that was not similar at all to what we see on a day-to-day basis for the last 3.5 years. And there's just really no way to explain that other than he was on something, that they'd given him medications. I feel like this is probably what's going on over this week at Camp David. He's going to be at Camp David for a full week before the debate. Part of that is probably experimenting with, just getting the doses just right because, they have to treat his cognition. They have to give him something to help him think straighter. They have to give him something to wake him up, for his alertness. And then, he's been agitated. We see that all the time, and that's a common symptom or sign of this cognitive disorder that he seems to be suffering from.
Oh, what a dirtbag! What an unethical, terrible thing for him to do on national television. But that's the move. That's the campaign. And on the run up to the debate, I guess we're going to hear more about drug testing President Biden, and they should drug test Trump too. That's the point. That's what everybody keeps saying for STDs. All right, speaking of them, Lady G was on Fox News, and guess what? He got called out.
Here, I've never been more worried about a 9/11 than I'm now, originating from a broken border started by a terrible decision to withdraw in Afghanistan.
So,
the world is on fire, folks, and Biden's not going to fix it.
Okay, so why haven't you guys fixed it? That's what he says. Right over here in the Capitol, that you guys know the problem, you agree there's a problem, and you haven't fixed it.
You know who I am? I was in the Gang of Eight.
I remember.
The bill they introduced was a joke when it came to parole.
Okay, all right. Well, there you go. Calm down, Lindsey Graham. You know who I am? I was on the Gang of Eight, and I love me some ham biscuits and a boy named Brad. All right, let's move on to yet another disgraceful person. But it's important to, I think, share this 30 seconds of the disgraced former president. Trigger alert. I am about to play him. And he's saying it out loud, folks. So let's make sure that we listen and take heed of what he's saying right here, because this is truth.
So we got this poll last night from Rasmussen, and it was they also did it like with Kennedy and with the other ones in there. Right? Cornel West. He's one of my favorite candidates, Cornel West. And I like her also, Jill Stein. I like her very much. You know why? She takes 100% from them. He takes 100%. Kennedy's probably 50-50, but he's a fake. He's a fake. He's a total fake. You don't want to vote for him because he takes from me, is what he was going to say. Yeah. Also, that was a rally. Where was he for that? Pennsylvania. Now here he is in Washington, D.C. at the Faith and Freedom Conference with a bunch of evangelical religious folks. And he said this. And I have the wounds all over my body. If I took this shirt off, you'd see a beautiful, beautiful person. But you'd see wounds all over me. I've taken a lot of wounds, I can tell you. More than I suspect any president ever.
How does that appeal to anybody, that kind of victimhood? It's so gross, so unappealing, so unattractive, and so unreal. The guy's probably, if he took his shirt off, you'd see he has no wounds. Maybe he had a mole removed or something like that, I suppose. I mean, the only wounds we can see are what we see every time we look at his stupid face, is his skin grafts and his awful scalp. All right, well, let's see. Let's move to Meet the Press. How about it? Okay, so Peter Alexander is in the host seat, and for some reason he invited, again, the governor of North Dakota. It's Kristi Noem. And, of course, he asks her about Kim Jong-un because Vladimir Putin met up with him, and she said she did, but she's lying. So here's a minute of that.
So let's talk about the book, having gone through much of it right now. This week, Russian President Vladimir Putin traveled to North Korea to meet with Kim Jong-un. In the first release of your book, you wrote, "I remember when I met with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, there was no evidence that that meeting happened." So how did it make it into your book, Governor?
I'm not going to talk about that.
You're not going to talk about how it made it in your book?
I took that line out of my book, and I'm not going to talk about it.
I guess my question is, you wrote the book, though, so why was that line ever in your book if it didn't happen?
I wrote the book, and I hope people will read it. It's a good book about how the American citizen can get involved in their government again and what they can do, and how the most powerful person in government is them. It's the people who show up, who get engaged, and the stories of what they can do to take this country back and how Donald Trump's policies work for the American people.
Understood. Then, just to put it to bed once and for all, did you or did you not meet with Kim Jong-un?
I am not going to talk about this.
Wouldn't it be why is that such a difficult one to say publicly?
Because I've taken that line out of the book, and I'm not going to discuss it.
Okay, but I guess the question is because you wrote it in the book, people just wanted to know whether that was an accurate or an inaccurate statement. Let me ask you.
Let's see. Here's a little bit more complete incoherence from her. Another 1 more minute.
What I have been very clear about is that we don't want to see another January 6th again. Nobody in this country wants to see another day like that again. And I believe that Donald Trump, when he comes back to the White House and is in charge of this country, we're going to have incredible opportunities to show that people in this country will be safer, that we'll have law and order back in our streets. If you look at one of the most violent areas of our country is often Democrat-run cities, sanctuary cities with an open border.
Well, in fact, violent crime in the country is down 50% since Joe Biden took office. But specifically, just to get back to this topic of the rioters, is Donald Trump wrong when he says he would pardon all of those who have been convicted in the January 6th attack?
Each of those individuals needs to be looked at separately as far as what their role was and what was happening in that situation.
And the 132 of them who admitted to assaulting law enforcement officers, would you agree that they should not be pardoned?
I think that every one of those cases needs to be looked at individually.
And
I think that January 6th,
agree that would be.
I think that this is what our judicial system is for. It's supposed to be the scales of justice, and Lady Justice is supposed to be blind.
Well, they went through the judicial system. He's offering to pardon them. So I guess the question is, would that be based on good grounds if they attack law enforcement officers?
That will be based on his prerogative and his decision when he looks at.
Because he is our dear leader, and we will do whatever he wants because he's Homelander. Anybody watching The Boys on Amazon? I don't recommend it if you're of weak heart. But I can't stop. I'm the worst. All right. Well, what else do I have for you? How about second gentleman, Doug Emhoff? He's the husband of Vice President Kamala Harris. And on Sunday, he was profiled on CBS News. And he said that Democrats have to win the election this year because the world literally depends on it. Let's listen to the husband of the vice president, the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff.
Do you ever think, well, you know, if things don't work out, we could always move back here and be just fine?
We're going to win this election. We have to win this election. Literally, our country and our world depends on us winning this election. That's what's going to happen.
All right, that's that CBS News sound. They were like walking on a sandy sidewalk. I don't know. Sorry about that. But how about this? Let's take a listen to this segment on MSNBC over the weekend. Got seen by a lot of people. The show is called The Weekend, and Simone Sanders Townsend was there with Michael Steele and this guy from the Heritage Foundation, the Project 2025. He boldly took all of their questions. His name is Dr. Kevin Roberts. And I just want to play this clip because I was really happy she got into it, pushing back on this ridiculous notion that Democrats want to kill babies when they're living.
Louisiana, in places all over this country, abortion care is unavailable to people that may need it. You and the organization in this plan talks about changing the Department of Health and Human Services to the Department of Life. Do you think that women in America should be able to get an abortion if that is what their doctor says they need?
Abortion's not health care. I find it really interesting, if not worse, that you wouldn't support the change of the department name to the Department of Life. I thought we were all in support of life. We believe eminently in women's rights, and particularly women's rights in the womb. And so the real question that you should be asking
I just want to know, if I may, though, because
why aren't we talking about the people who are supporting legislation that abortion can happen until 3 days after the person's born? This is an absurd framing by this network.
That is an absurd assertion. As a person with an actual womb, I'm telling you that does not happen.
So but let me just back up. Legislators in California, Virginia, in New York who
Dr.
actually
Roberts,
filed those bills.
Does Heritage and Project 2025 believe that a woman should be able to have an abortion if her doctor says that she needs one? It's a yes or no question.
Abortion is not health care.
So
abortion
that is
is
a
the
no?
murder of a human being.
All right. Well, I disagree thoroughly with Dr. Kevin Roberts, but I am so glad that you were here, and we are so disappointed you couldn't hear Alicia. So that means you got to come back, Dr. Roberts.
All right. Yeah, they really want him to come on. And all I've got for you here on the audio clips, I want to get to my two guests. I'm sorry, I don't even have a comedy clip for you. What is going on? I'm really phoning it in, not doing my job. Sorry about that, folks. But I'm at my parents' in the makeshift childhood bedroom studio, and I want to get to my guests who I think are both great. They're both really good, close, personal friends of mine that I adore, that I look up to, that I seek advice from. Both Bill and Eric are two very important people in my life. I trust them tremendously, and I think they're brilliant. I don't always agree with them on everything, but I certainly wouldn't want to be in much of an argument with them, even though I've tried a couple times. All right, Bill Boyle coming up, and we talk about, of course, the debate coming up, a little bit about the campaign, recent polling, but then we quickly get overseas where we talk about the Middle East and Ukraine, Russia and China and more. It's a great conversation as always with Boyle, but first we've got to get Eric Segall on here to talk about what we learned from the Supreme Court on Friday and what is coming up potentially this week. He was in a mood, and he's always great all the time. We caught up with both these guys on Sunday night, and I'm so glad I did. Eric Segall, of course, the host of the Supreme Myths podcast, and in the near future, maybe hopefully co-hosting one with me about everything. I'm looking forward to that someday. You can follow him on Twitter, where he's still very active at eSpinSegall. Of course, he's a constitutional law scholar at Georgia State University down there in Atlanta. Get both his books, Originalism as Faith and Supreme Myths. This guy keeps gaining credibility, and wait for it, a Posner mention within the first couple of minutes. So get a drink out. Let's do it right now with the Legal Eagle. It is Sunday night, and I've got him, Eric Segall, in mid-June. Tough to get a constitutional scholar as prestigious as you at this time of year with all these decisions coming down, but you're very good to us. Thank you for joining me on a Sunday night between, I guess, 1 week of decisions and certain another, right?
Who knows? It's hard to believe they're going to finish all this week. They have a bunch left. It may go into the first couple days of July. That is very rare, but it has happened before. But let's just be clear at the outset. This whole idea of a June 30th deadline for issuing all the decisions is a made-up, fake, silly deadline. Sorry to bring this up so quickly, but my old friend Judge Posner used to rant about it.
Oh, wow. Right away, folks. Let's drink.
Right away. But it's the dumbest thing. So, Pete, I'll give you an example real quick. So when the big Obamacare case came out in 2012, and everybody was shocked that Justice Roberts found a way to join the other the liberals to uphold the law by calling it a tax, even though it wasn't a tax. That opinion was really messy. Scalia's dissent read more like like the majority, and Roberts was read weirdly, and it was clear they rushed it at the last minute. That was like the most important case of the last 40 years. I mean, they've made mistakes before by rushing things, and it's just no other court works this way. If you have a big case in front of the Court of Appeals, they will issue the decision when they're done.
Got to get to their beach houses and hang their flags.
Not so much beach houses. It's more Salzburg and Rome and places like that. 1 week, last time, 2 times ago, I think I was on your pod, maybe 3 times ago, I was yelling about you asked about Justice Alito's comments outside his house, and I responded to you. His Rome speech was much worse.
Yes.
And his Rome speech was 5 days after Dobbs came out, effectively. So most of them go off and teach in the summer, or, not teach, but give talks in Europe. But anyway, that's the point. They're doing really important stuff. And to rush it all at the end is just silly. Right. And I think they do it to be drama queens and kings. Because why do it this way? I don't understand it.
So just to be clear, this week we'll have decisions. They can come out anytime, but they generally come out Monday and Thursday?
The court has said so far, I think Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, not Monday, Tuesday.
Oh, okay.
I hate that, Pete. Sorry, hold on. Did you hear that noise?
I did hear a noise. Some kind of a computer thing went off. It was very upsetting to me and all of those listening. And I'm not going to be able to edit that out.
I hope it.
I wish I could edit me stuttering on the way to explaining that I couldn't edit it out.
My friend, you're a little serious today. I have to de-serious you.
I'm just making jokes at your expense. I'm good. I'm good. I have a sty. I have an eye sty. It's really
Meanwhile, I have PTSD and no one's coming to my assistance.
For what's going on with you?
So there's this huge case on Friday. The Supreme Court does exactly what I predicted it was going to do. Let's start at the beginning.
Yeah, United States versus Rahimi, where the court concluded that at least some people subject to domestic violence restraining orders do not have a categorical right to own a firearm. And the Supreme Court upheld this law preventing them from doing so, and everybody says it's good news.
So, Pete, the case, the court decided a bunch of cases on Friday, and there was more than one important case. But by far and away, the most important case was this gun case. And I don't know anybody who thought there could be people out there, but I don't know anybody who thought the Supreme Court was going to affirm the lower court decision. They reversed it. Let me explain what the lower court decision was, because it's so outrageously horrible.
So no one was surprised necessarily by this outcome.
Correct. Okay. Yeah. Because here's why. The way you described it was a fair, you get an A for description.
Well, I'm just reading an article, but yeah.
And it was accurate, but it's not the real story. The real story is there's a guy in Texas who had used a gun on numerous occasions to threaten his girlfriend, and had shot the gun off illegally on numerous occasions. That's Rahimi. Yes, and he was clearly a violent person who was subject to a domestic relations protective order. There's a federal statute that says if you're subject to a domestic relations protective order, you can't be armed. You can't have a gun. It's against the law, which is a very good law. We all agree that. I don't care what anybody says. It's a good law. If you are subject to a domestic relations protective order, so you can't go within 50 feet or 1,000 feet of your spouse or partner, that means you have a history of doing something violent, and you shouldn't have a gun. The Fifth Circuit said that was a violation of the Second Amendment in an insane opinion. The concurring opinion by Judge Ho, who is a famous insane person, was also crazy and insane. And no one thought the court was going to affirm it, not even this court. But Pete, but they get no credit for this. They don't. Because, for one thing, this was a challenge to the entire law. In other words, they wanted to strike down the law on its face, meaning the law that prohibits people subject to domestic relations protective orders, they're not allowed to be disarmed under the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
That's insane. Because this guy was a violent, guilty guy. Now, some people said protective orders are given out too frequently, and not everybody who gets them is dangerous. And you shouldn't lose a constitutional right because you're the subject of a domestic relations protective order. Clark Nelly, who we both like, has made that argument. But that wasn't this case. This case was about a guy who was violent, and Justice Roberts, that's the first thing he says in the majority opinion.
Yeah.
That, well, this guy can obviously be disarmed. We don't have to talk about other people because this guy can't win. 8-1, only the nutcase Justice Thomas dissented because he is truly gone. Justice Thomas is gone. He's a corrupt, gone person. He's just gone.
What do you mean by gone?
Well, he just issued an opinion saying that a guy who had threatened his girlfriend on numerous occasions and had committed violence had a constitutional right to own a gun. So if that's not, 8 other justices disagreed. In addition, I don't want to get into this tonight. This is for a longer podcast. But the Bruin case from 2 years ago that you and I have been talking about, that I have called insanity. I called that insanity in 2 different law review articles. Justice Jackson on Friday called that decision madness, which is very close to insanity.
She referred to that case similarly to how you have.
Yeah. Yes, and that's because it is madness and insanity.
And you feel a sense of redemption having Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Whether she said it, no, I don't feel redemption because whether she said it or not, it is madness. But yeah, and all 8 justices other than Thomas tried to run away from that decision as best they could 2 years later. He wrote a terrible decision. It was incoherent. It was like a 5th grade opinion. He's both crooked and stupid, which is an amazing thing. But anyway,
I've heard this interpretation by a few different people who I read, which was the gun case, Bruin case, which is about carrying firearms in public.
Yeah.
In this case, the justices ran from their decision. They thought they went too far. They thought they went.
Yes.
And then they dialed it back with the next gun case they got.
Yeah.
Why would they? Well, just real quick. It sounds stupid that you would look back at your decision and go, I went too far. Like, why go too far? Why not get it right?
So
I don't understand.
I gotta back up. But you don't seem very caring about my PTSD, which I haven't even mentioned.
I'm sorry. Let me get to what's causing you the.
No one cares about Eric's PTSD.
We do care. The people here care.
No,
we do.
Don't.
Seriously.
The answer to your question, though, Pete, is, and I don't know how to say this because I have never said of a Justice Alito opinion, I have never said, oh, that's sloppy and poorly done. I disagree with them. They're heinous. They're immoral. But they're judicial opinions like everybody writes. Roberts has done some dastardly things, but his opinions are competent. I'm trying to think. Justice Rehnquist wrote competent opinions. Okay. I hated everything he wrote, but they were competent judicial opinions. I can't stress this enough. I said it at the time. Bruen was incompetency. It was incompetency laid upon corruption. It's like the worst of all combinations. And all 8 justices, the 5 conservatives other than Thomas and the 3 liberals know this. It was a negligent decision when issued, which is why you had lower court judges saying exactly that. This opinion is crazy. We're not historians. What do you want us to do with history here? We don't have the tools to do this. We have to hire historians to be special. It was crazy. But none of that compares to what Justice Kavanaugh did.
This is where your PTSD lies, because of something Justice Kavanaugh did, and I think I know what you're.
And I want to set it up this way: the opinion comes out. I do a few tweets when I see the bottom line. Then I go to
the Rahimi opinion, 8-1, 8-1.
So first thing I do is I skim it like everybody else does. Make a couple tweets. I had a couple media things, and then I sat down and really read it carefully. And Roberts' opinion is not terrible. It's okay. It's workmanlike. It's pretty good. And then I'm reading Sotomayor, who concurred. She was fine. Then I'm reading Gorsuch, and it's a bunch of words that don't mean anything, but that's okay. And then I get to Kavanaugh. And he starts by saying, the role of history and tradition in constitutional law is being debated all over the place in our opinions by scholars. I'm going to give you my perspective. And he writes like 15 pages of a law review article on his perspective on how we should use text, history, tradition, and policy in constitutional law. It's like a mini law review article. And I'm reading it, and it's terrible, but I'm like, all right, I get what he's doing. And then I get to it, Pete. I see it. He doubles down on something that I don't believe any human being has doubled down on before who's not certifiably insane. So now we have a certifiably insane justice on the Supreme Court. He doubled down on Chief Justice Roberts' comments during the confirmation hearings, which I don't think Roberts has ever repeated because he knows how stupid it is, that justices and judges are just umpires. We just apply the rules. We don't make the rules. No one comes to the game to see the umpire. We just apply the rules made by other people. He doubled down on it!
Why is that so bad? I don't know why that's so bad for him to have mentioned in this case, or why it was so bad looking back at Roberts saying it. Sounds
Tomorrow morning, I have a podcast. I'm sorry. I'm so upset about this. I have a blog post coming out on Dorf on Law. This is what Judge Posner said about Justice Roberts' comments about being an umpire.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
This is Richard Posner, the leading intellectual in America of the 20th century, not legal intellectual, the leading intellectual of our time, as voted by other people. Judges and justices, Roberts said, judges and justices are servants of the law, not the other way around. Judges are like umpires. Umpires don't make the rules, they apply them. That's what Roberts said.
Sounds good. Sounds like a very good answer for a judge to say.
No serious person thinks that rules that judges in our system apply, especially judges and most importantly, the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, are given to them the way rules are given to them, the way rules of baseball are given to umpires. The rules are created by the judges themselves. They are created out of materials that include constitutional and statutory language, blah, blah, blah. And they run out in interesting cases, meaning the Supreme Court makes the rules. Sure, there's a big belief. Free speech is good. But everything else, the Supreme Court decides. Sure, equal protection is good. Does that mean we can have affirmative action? Apparently not, right? Obscenity is not speech. Actually, it is. It is. Obscenity is expression. The court says it isn't. And so on, and 1,000 other cases.
Right.
Kavanaugh to double down on judges as umpires flies in the face of everything that's happened since Justice Roberts made that comment.
Right.
And what it really is, Pete, what Justice Kavanaugh is beyond everything else, except maybe a beer drinker, is he is 1990s Republican Party. And in 1995, in the Republican Party, there was this absurd fiction that judges interpret laws and don't make laws. But no one believes that. That was a talking point that Ed Meese used for political reasons, that Sean Hannity puts and Laura Ingraham puts on their Fox News. But no one, do you think judges don't make rules, Pete? Do you think they just interpret rules made by other people?
I used to before I started talking to you.
I mean, but okay, you had an excuse. Kavanaugh does not.
Right.
And by the way, the other so all of that, the whole umpire thing is in service of the rest of his opinion, which says the following. The only way to keep judges from having too much discretion is for them to rely exclusively on history and not policy. Something that describes no one. There's no judge in the history of our country who acts that way. You can't apply the rule, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, without talking about policy. You just can't. And you can't talk about equal protection history. They don't do it that way. They make a policy decision and justify it with legal materials, and everybody knows that. So so Pete, here's the punchline and why I have PTSD. He's either stupid or lying, or is there both? Maybe both. But he has to be one of those things because he must know that the phrase Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or respecting an establishment of religion or not denying free exercise of religion are not self-defining terms. They're a term. It's like one of my better tweets of the last year was the following. If a recipe written in 1905 says use 3 cups of milk, 100 years later, 3 cups of whole milk, 100 years later, we know what 3 cups of whole milk means.
Right.
Even if whole milk has changed, we still know what 3 cups of whole milk means. If that recipe said use a reasonable amount of milk, use a reasonable amount of milk. That's what this and it's 20,024, and it was written in 1905. Imagine a rule that says you have to be mature to drive, written in 1905. And they thought that meant 21. They didn't write it down, but they thought they meant 21. If we're going to decide in 2024 what maturity means, we're not going to use 1905 standards. We're going to use 2024 standards. And that's what the judges have to do in constitutional law, because everything they're interpreting is 1868 or older. So when you have words like equal protection and due process and freedom of speech and free exercise, to say we can define those terms through history is insane. They're not historical terms.
I understand why you're so affected, and we're all here for you.
Thank you.
Want to, before you go, I want to just ask you your thoughts on what happened in Louisiana, where the governor signed a bill that will allow the 10 Commandments, it actually insists the 10 Commandments be posted in the classroom. You saw this coming. What are your thoughts?
The Supreme Court over the last 5 years or so has so rewritten the law of the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That also applies to the states, obviously. They've gone so far in the direction of religious supremacy that I'm not surprised this happened at all. Other states are going to do it. People should know there's a Supreme Court case directly on point. So the lower courts have to strike this down. Now, will the Fifth Circuit strike it down? I don't know. The Supreme Court is reversing the Fifth Circuit every term. Right.
You said the Fifth Circuit is more extreme than the Supreme Court.
It is. Yeah. Empirically, it is. We can prove that. Yeah. So the lower courts should strike this down. And, Pete, there was once a time when 5 different Supreme Court justices in different cases, not in the same case, agreed that a certain case had to be overruled. So 5 justices said that, but never in the same case. And some lower courts said, well, we can count to 5. So we're going to strike down this law based on this principle that 5 judges have agreed to in different cases. Supreme Court slammed that. and said, no, you can't do that. You have to wait for us. We have to reverse it first. And that's what they're going to do here, because there's a case directly on point. You cannot put the 10 Commandments in the classroom. Directly on point. When it gets back to
there's a previous case on this point.
Edwards versus Aguilar.
Got it.
Yes. And it's not unclear. You can't put 10 Commandments in classrooms. But of course.
So why did they do it then? Why did Louisiana do it? I mean, obviously they did it for politics, but.
So the best analogy I can give you, Pete, is imagine a state that is trying to do something about slavery in 1857 that the Supreme Court doesn't allow, but they really think slavery is immoral. But you can't get back to the Supreme Court on the issue. They've already decided it. Sometimes what the government has to do is go to lower courts and say, look, our hands are tied here. We know we have to lose, but we have to bring the case. Now, what's changed with the Fifth Circuit is they're going to make some arguments about how this case is different than that other Supreme Court case. It's not different. They're going to claim that it is, and maybe they can find some unpersuasive factual difference. Doesn't matter. When the case gets to the Supreme Court, they are very likely to reverse the old case and allow the 10 Commandments in classrooms, because we have a Supreme Court that believes that basically believes in religious supremacy. So,
and does not believe in
the thing about the 10 Commandments, though, is that it's not only a atheist agnostic insult, but it's an insult to Muslims. I mean, it's an insult to Native American. I mean, it's an insult to all the religions of the world that don't use the 10 Commandments. By the way, like 4 of those commandments violate the First Amendment. You should have no God before me. That can't be enforced in America. I can have any God I want before you. Thou shalt not take my name in vain. I can't be arrested for saying God sucks. So a bunch of the commandments do things that are unconstitutional. It's insane.
You think the Supreme Court will allow for it? They'll overturn the precedent, the earlier case that you mentioned, and that allows the 10 Commandments. But won't they then have to allow all the satanic verses? And
no, because you've forgotten that the Supreme Court is under no obligation to be coherent over time, and they're not. They're not. You know that, Pete. The fact that Supreme Court held last year, a year ago this month, that Harvard and University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and every other university in America that receives federal funding or is public, which is every university, basically, can't use affirmative action. That's what it said. And then it dropped a footnote saying nothing we're saying here applies to West Point, the military, and the other military academies. Why not? Why does it apply to Harvard and Stanford and University of Missouri and Valdosta State and Alfred University and Buffalo, but not West Point? Like, why? Because that's what they said. It's the only reason.
I wish you had gone on and listed 90 other colleges before you finally made your point about the military academies. So
I must make one more minute of comments about Justice Kavanaugh before we go.
Okay.
So I really don't want people to skip over this. So again, I don't think there's been a law review article written. Maybe there is. If you can find it, don't yell at me. Justice Roberts was right. Supreme Court justices are just umpires. And it wasn't like this wasn't noticed. Like everybody heard Roberts say this. It was in the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today. Like this was a big deal at the time. That's why Posner commented on it. Like I read to you. So I want people to really put themselves in Justice Kavanaugh's seat for a second. Okay, really important. All right. By what he said in his opinion was, we don't make the rules, we don't make policy, and we shouldn't make policy. All we do is look at text and history and precedent and see what it says. We're like a messenger. We don't do anything. Okay. If he believes that, then he's really stupid. And if he doesn't believe it, why is he saying it? And he's a Supreme Court justice. And that's how far our standards have dropped. And I will tell you the person who did it, Clarence Thomas, because he is so bad on every level, corruption, competency, morality. He's so bad on every level that a monster like Kavanaugh, who is likely a sexual harasser, who, if nothing else, promised revenge for being accused of sexual harassment. That's a great quality for a Supreme Court justice. I'm going to take revenge on you because you accused me of something. They both did that. Thomas did that too. So when he says we're umpires, what he is saying is, I'm doubling down on everything that entails. We're just judges. Don't blame us. And it is Pete, no one believes that. No one.
In your world. Most people don't have any idea about this stuff, courts and judges, and they just think that the robe works.
It's funny you say that. Just today, a law professor at Georgetown came at me a liberal, progressive law professor, came at me on Twitter and was questioning why I've raised my rhetoric about originalism and I've raised my tweets about it because I can't take it anymore. And he questioned the worth of that. He said, "Why? We all know it doesn't decide anything. Why talk about it?" And you have no idea how many people came to my aid, and before I even did, and said, "But they keep talking about it. They keep relying on it. They keep saying they're using it. If they're not, we need people like Eric to point that out, and he shouldn't stop." And that's so obvious. I mean, that should be so. This law professor, I'm not going to mention his name, was very. I know where he was coming from. Like, sure, if nobody was talking about originalism, I wouldn't be talking. I'm the guy who wrote an article in 1999, saying we should stop talking about originalism forever. We should stop talking about it. It does no work. It's a waste of time. It's mental masturbation.
It just made me think. It made me think of the point that a lot of people always say: if you would just stop talking about racism so much, why are you always talking about racism? And the answer is, like, I would love to not be talking about racism if everything wasn't so damn racist.
Yes, that's a perfect. I can't do better than that. You have won the podcast. That's exactly right.
I won.
And I didn't even have to say it to him because other people came in.
Yeah, that's great.
Like, what are you talking about? What I said actually was Randy Barnett, law professor, Larry Solomon, law professor, number of justices, a number of politicians, a number of national pundits are all saying originalism is real. I'm not saying it. They're saying it. I'm responding to that. It was very weird. But the same thing is true of this umpire comment, Pete. I thought, though, we had put that to rest. Like, I thought no one. Roberts wants to run away from it. Like, I never, almost saying, he just wants to forget he said it. I can't believe Kavanaugh doubled. Sorry, I'm done.
Thank you very much for joining me, for taking my dad's question, for being here on a Sunday night. We love you, and we're all very worried about your PTSD. And don't you believe anything otherwise. All right.
Like, I will go back to my. The good thing is it'll end on Wednesday when they do more terrible things.
Right. Yes.
Oh, there's a case on, and then I'm sorry, Pat. One more really.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Do we have time?
Yeah.
So, a lot of people, including Jonathan Adler and others, were like, "See, 8-1 liberal result. What are you guys complaining about? What are you talking about? Partisan Supreme Court." And the response by everybody smart to that was, "Wait a minute. This guy threatened his girlfriend with violence with a gun. The lower court said he had a right to have that gun. And you think it's a big deal that 8 justices overturned that? Like, what are you talking about? What sane person says, oh, you threatened your girlfriend with a gun? Sure. Take it." I mean, that's what we all knew was going to come out this way. And it's why they took and they had to take the case because the Fifth Circuit was crazy. But they were this was perfect for them. This was the perfect case for the Supreme Court.
Right. For them to try to create that narrative that they aren't partisan.
Yes. But if they had upheld this, Pete, the headline would have been, "Person who threatens girlfriend with gun allowed to keep gun." That's what it would have been.
Yes. He was a lot worse than you've said, by the way. I looked at the guy had been involved in several shootings and so on.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, my friend.
All right. All right, there he goes. Go tell him you appreciate him stopping by. Always great. Eric Segall, Supreme Myths Podcast. Get his books. Follow him on social media. And always awesome. So much fun. All right, now let's get to my second guest on today's show. That's right, I've got 2. And he is one of our favorite people to talk to. He used to call into the show, and now he joins us on the show. You can often find him at our Hangouts on Thursday night. He is one of us, and we love him for it. Bill B in D.C. on Blue Sky and Twitter. Find him in Washington, D.C. if you're down there. Let's do it right now. Great conversation with Bill. What are your thoughts about this upcoming debate, and will you be at our debate party?
So I normally don't watch debates because I just get completely irritated by them. And what really matters is the reaction to them anyway. So I'm one of those people who typically avoids it, although sometimes I do out of whatever. And maybe I will come Thursday. It probably all depends on what my social calendar looks like.
Oh.
But this debate is happening at a very interesting time. As you note, it's really early in the campaign. Trump wanted that. And I think that Trump wanted that when it looked like he was like kind of in control, but not way ahead. If he was up by 5 or 10 points, he just wouldn't bother to show up. He would do a Rose Garden strategy and he would blow it off or whatever. Now he's in a position where he's a little bit behind, I think, fairly clearly now. And so he is definitely, and people are saying, oh, is he going to show or not? He has to show up for this debate now because he has to try to make up ground that he's clearly losing since his conviction in New York. I think for Biden, it's a very straightforward thing. If he goes in, looks alert, looks fresh, has good answers, doesn't have to do anything other than hit a bunch of singles and doubles, and Trump will be a lunatic and yell and scream, and that's all Biden has to do to win. So the bar is low for Biden, really, almost no matter what. Trump's problem, too, is that to pretend that Biden is some doddering old man who doesn't know his own name just makes it easy for Biden. He just looks alert, looks sharp, says things well, and that's it. It's done. For Trump, it's a much more complicated problem he has because people love Trump for him being outrageous and ridiculous and screaming and showing the libs and showing the establishment that he doesn't respect their rules, right? But that's not going to get him a single new voter. That's not going to convince anybody to vote for him. So Trump, I think, is a really hard spot because if he goes in and acts statesman-like, people are going to be like, who the fuck is this guy? Right? He can't fake that. He doesn't have his id is his brand, and he doesn't have anywhere to go from that. So I think it's going to be, barring some disaster, barring something really coming out of left field, I think it's going to be a fairly straightforward Biden win. And by the way, couldn't be happening at a worse time for Trump.
His id is his brand. Why? Speak to the timing. Sorry. Why do you think that's so crucial?
It's crucial because if Biden has been working his way up into probably a 1 or 2 point lead. If Biden goes in there and Trump crashes and burns, Biden might be up by 5 or 6 or 3 or 4, which is a lot in this race in a month. And then you're in August and then suddenly you're in September. There's one more debate. And that's kind of it. I mean, it really, you can very easily see a situation where Biden kind of gets his teeth into a lead and doesn't really give it up again.
Have you heard the rumors that they're now becoming more mainstream among the right? Ronnie Jackson, whatever his name is out talking on the Sunday shows today saying that Biden should be drug tested. It sounds so absurd and so abnormal, yet he's a congressman. He's a Navy guy, the former doctor at the White House.
Yeah, he's an alcoholic as well.
Oh, really?
Ronnie Jackson's a fucking mess. I knew people who were around him in the White House.
Well, regardless, he's out there as well as a whole bunch of other influential folks on the right saying that Biden should be drug tested. I mean, how do you see where we're at when that is the conversation, that is the strategy, that is the attack? He must be on something. They're going to have to put him on something, on some kind of drugs. Right. Hey, maybe he is on some kind of drugs, by the way. Let's leave it open for possibility.
Well, 2 things. Number one, it tells you everything about how shite our media environment is, that's even a story. Ronnie Jackson, everyone in Washington knows Ronnie Jackson's was handing out drugs like candy when he was in the White House. He's got a drinking problem. He's a clown. He's an extremist. Why the fuck is NBC putting him out there saying that? It's ridiculous. And that's number one. Number two, I can tell you right now, the Biden team would very happily say, we'll take a drug test before and after if Trump will. Because you can bet Trump's drug test will be like a cornucopia of insanity. And it'll be, all kinds of stuff that's going on with Trump. The rumors are out there and they're pretty clear that Trump himself, is almost certainly taking something. So it's like for the Biden people, it's a win-win. You want to, but I think they'll just say this beneath the dignity of us and fuck off.
Right.
But at the same time, Jackson is saying that. I'm not sure the Trump people are very happy he's saying that. Because I don't think they want a lot of scrutiny on their own behavior.
Yeah, fair enough. He was on Fox News. I don't know.
Well, NBC it was their number 2 story on NBC's website.
Oh, really? Ugh.
Yeah, and that's just ridiculous. Like that is just like without any sort of judgment, just lapping up the bullshit that the Trump campaign is or the Trump supporters are churning out.
Right.
The story shouldn't even be on NBC, and if it is, here's this ridiculous thing being said by this ridiculous person.
How important do you think the conventions are coming up?
I don't think conventions are important at all anymore, except in as much as they are not a disaster. So if you go to a convention and there's a real problem, it can hurt you. I mean, Hillary Clinton's convention was bad. because there was obvious disagreement in the crowd. It was the Bernie people who probably have themselves to, thank for Hillary losing a point or two in the election in 2016. And so in that case, it's bad. No one ever went to a convention, though, and they're like, wow, this is so great, and we just got 5 points. You get like sort of a built-in little bump that's purely a product of a ton of media attention for that week.
Right.
And then it fades away in a couple days after that. So, conventions are good theater. I don't really think they matter all that much.
The DNC is in mid-August in Chicago. The RNC is July 15th to 18th coming up in Milwaukee, which is a terrible city, according to the nominee.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the foreign issues that you care so much about, think so much about, read so much about, and have a lot of thoughts on. First of all, what are your thoughts on what is happening right now in Gaza, in Israel, in the Middle East? There's so much, obviously, to discuss there. There's still a lot of hostages that have been taken, that are being held, and obviously the violence is continuing, although it's confusing to know exactly what's happening all the time. And we could talk about agreements, and Netanyahu is still, I think, planning to come to D.C. and address Congress, although he's been disinvited and savaged by the White House and the Secretary of State because he is savaging them. And it looks like he's got his finger on the scale, obviously. I mean, Netanyahu seems like his future, his freedom is almost dependent on Donald Trump getting reelected the way that he's talking. What are your thoughts about Netanyahu and the war in the Middle East, the invasion, the Gaza violence, all of it, however you prefer to call it?
So, as you know, I'm pretty agnostic on this issue.
But I still want your take.
Yeah, I'm not a huge, so maybe to give this a little credibility, the way I see it right now, Hamas was given a good deal and Hamas rejected it. And now Netanyahu is forcing Israel now to pull out, I believe, from the potentially signing that deal. So you have a situation where neither side really can say yes. This round, honestly, is Hamas's fault. If Hamas, the deal they were offered was a pretty good deal, Qatar wanted them to take it, the Saudis wanted them to take it, it would have been okay. And Hamas said, no, we're not going to do it because Hamas, just like Bibi, can't really live without the war happening, right? The war keeps them in power. It keeps Hamas in power. It keeps Bibi in power. Without the struggle, what do you need Hamas for? And so where we are at right now is Hamas is just not going to make a deal, I think, period, unless they're so exhausted that they just have to. And Israel doesn't really have a government. Bibi, I just was reading the council minutes from the Israeli government from a day or two ago.
As one does.
Bibi has ministers saying we want the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, to have a military government to run Gaza. The IDF is like, no, we don't want to fucking do that. We're not designed for that.
Right.
And the IDF is basically saying no to the Prime Minister of Israel because they know the Prime Minister of Israel doesn't have enough power to tell them what to do, really. So you have the Israeli state that is like not really being led. It's just continuing on. And the guy who should be able to lead it, who has lost his mandate and is hated by 60% of his country, Bibi, he's out there really just working the angles, hoping that Trump wins, hoping that he can stay in power longer. It's a weird situation because on the Israeli side, it's not like a country operating as a country, and not a government operating as a government. It's basically one guy who they cannot get out of that office, who is trying to manipulate the situation in American politics and Israeli politics to keep himself out of jail. So it's a very weird sort of setup because it's not normal international relations, normal politics. It is absolutely insane for Bibi Netanyahu to go on TV when he's about to come to Congress and speak in the United States and basically attack the Biden administration, who held up like one shipment of one weapon system, and say, oh, they're starving us of weapons. And the IDF, by the way, lost their fucking minds when they heard Bibi say that, because they know and they acknowledge how utterly dependent Israel is on American aid. But why does Bibi do it? Because, as you said, he hopes Trump will win. He hopes Trump will in some way bail him out if he gets pushed out as Prime Minister of Israel. And so it's an awful situation because it's not going to get better until things get resolved in the Israeli government. And where we are right now, by the way, is that Israel, the IDF is kind of doing what they're going to do. And it looks like, are planning an offensive into Lebanon in about a month. And if that is the outcome that the Biden administration has been trying desperately to avoid.
Right.
But everybody sits there and goes, oh man, these guys suck. They're this, they're that. No, the Biden administration has Hamas. They have no influence over, and Hamas is just also a mess and incredibly extreme and incredibly stupid. And Israel has basically the military going one way, the government going another way, et cetera. And the whole thing they're trying to avoid is a bigger war in the Middle East, because a big war in Lebanon would be a whole other situation. And that's where we are. So it's, I guess I don't really have a conclusion about it because it's not clear which way it's going to go. I hope Israel comes to its senses, gets rid of Bibi, and doesn't invade Lebanon. But I think I'm going to be wrong on that. I think my hopes are going to be dashed.
Let's go from the Middle East to the UK, where they have called for elections, and there's a scandal unfolding unlike anything I've ever heard of anywhere. It's a betting scandal. Let me just read from British outlet The Guardian. A senior Conservative official has become the fourth party figure subject to an investigation by the gambling watchdog, amid reports he placed dozens of bets on the timing of the election before it was announced. So four members, Tory party members, apparently, do I have it right? They were potentially, or at least being investigated for placing bets. Apparently that's a thing you could do. You can place a bet on anything in certain markets. I suppose it's the same in the UK, or it's international, as to when there would be a new election. And you can have insider information on such things as you can on any number of things that might be betted on. We've heard this in sports with players, betting, and coaches and so on. It seems like I've never heard of it in politics. How big of a deal is this, and what does it mean for the elections? By the way, John Oliver does a deep dive on it on this week's Last Week Tonight.
Oh, cool. So I hope I live up to John Oliver's take on it. So a detail about the betting that is amazing to me is that at least one, but I think all of the folks who bet, who were in Tory leadership, these are not like, this isn't a guy who's at a desk who happens to be down the hall from the prime minister. These are members of parliament who were involved in the planning. And at least one, but I think more of them, they bet amounts that they knew were below the statutory reporting requirement. So like
smart
at £300 or something, or euros, or pounds, I guess in that case, that automatically gets reported to the tax people. Right. They've made this bet. That's called structuring in American law, where you keep your transactions below the reporting limit in order to avoid having notice be given to, agencies that regulate these things. Right. Which means that there's no way to say at all that whoopsie daisy, I just had a stupid moment in the office and I made this bet. It was all a joke. The way they bet, they literally were very intentionally planning to make sure it stayed under the radar. And what's crazy about this is English journalists are as rapacious as any journalist in the world, to the level that some places like the Daily Mail will pay people for information. How these clowns did not understand that this was going to become public is just unbelievable, and it gets at exactly what it was wrong with the Tories and with Brexit and with everything else. These guys are the Tories in Britain are feckless, selfish, stupid, greedy. They are every left-wing communist idea of gross right-wing establishment made into flesh. And I will tell you, it could not possibly have come they're already in disastrous free fall in their election, but this is just the cherry on top, right? It's just so perfectly encapsulates how fucking awful they are. And there's a decent chance that the Tories will end up with only about 60 seats in Parliament. They're going to lose 300 seats plus. Just going to get destroyed. And it's going to be the biggest loss for the Tories. I believe, I forget, I looked it up, 1856 or something. You got to go back more than a century, well more than a century, to find anything like the beatdown they're going to get on July 4th, which feels incredibly apropos.
That's right. I was about to ask when the election was. July 4th. Yeah, coming up. Let's stay in Europe and talk about what's happening with extremism in France and Germany especially. A lot of really interesting journalism, and people should pay attention to it, talking about what's happening there and who the players are and how it's unfolding and why. And we can talk about the rest of Europe as well, but I think specifically Germany and France and their elections and the movement is getting obviously a lot of coverage, and maybe it's more poignant, or that's not the word, right? But because of the history of those countries and extremism and you know, World War II. So what are your thoughts on what's happening? How concerned are you about the far right movement and the traction it seems to be gaining a lot more and being, quote, more normalized in many ways as well?
Yeah. So Francis Fukuyama, when he wrote the End of History, which people denigrate because they're idiots and haven't read it, he had this part of it where he said that, you know, by the end of history, it means that we get to a point where democracies, liberal democracies, are like the ultimate form of government. And you get there with the end of the Soviet Union. And everyone realizes that's the guys that are going to win. But what people do, he said, is that when you get to that final point where it's obvious liberal democracies are like what works, there's no other system that ideologically or even, you know, performatively do better than it. People automatically start fighting that system, right? So during the Cold War, a lot of these people that are now AfD or Le Penists or whatever, or Republicans in America, who would have been vehement anti-communists and so supported democracy.
Right.
Now the communism is gone. Now they're fighting democracy. And it's this atavistic right-wing tradition that it has been in, you know, France was a far more anti-Semitic place before the Nazi era than Germany was, right? France had the incredibly strong and powerful right-wing movements. The Boulangists almost launched a coup in 1934. Almost launched a coup in the late 19th century. There was almost a right-wing coup in 1934 in France. You know, Germany, obviously we know, right? So these movements are always out there. They've always been out there. If you're talking about AfD in Germany, they're basically neo-Nazis in sheep's clothing, and not even really sheep's clothing. And I've been in Eastern Germany a couple of years ago. I was in Weimar, Germany, right down the road from Buchenwald. And I ended up in a bar talking to two 30-some-odd-year-old guys. And I was absolutely shocked. They're young, to me anyway. I was shocked. They turned out to be really hardcore right-wingers who thought Russia was awesome and America was an imperialist power that was keeping Germany away from its greatness. And I have to tell you, the Czech bartender would have happily jumped over the bar with me and beaten the crap. And it was really like a eye-opener for me. Now, I will tell you, the AfD in Germany, they only win quite literally within the borders of what used to be the German Democratic Republic. They don't win in Bavaria, which is actually a conservative place, but it's not. Bavaria is very anti the AfD, right? They're like Catholic conservatives who think that the AfD are Nazis and won't have anything to do with them. They don't win in Berlin. They don't win in any of the cities. They don't win in the West. You know, they're mostly an East German phenomenon. And I don't worry about them too much. I worry a lot more about France, because France are either going to have a left-wing, sort of anti-Semitic, sort of pro-Russia government, or you're going to have a right-wing, sort of anti-Semitic, sort of pro-Russian government. It's either Le Pen or Mélenchon, who's the popular front on the left. And Le Pen obviously is, you know, I don't even know what the hell her party's called anymore. They changed them around. And then in the middle, you've got Macron's government. And here's what's really crazy about France right now. Prices are down. They've tamed inflation. Jobs reports are really good. You know, France is really in a like economic boom and revival, and much healthier on paper than Germany is, or than a lot of other places. And it doesn't seem to matter. People in France are going towards one extreme or the other that really resemble each other in many ways. So it concerns me quite a bit, and it concerns me, of course, for Ukraine, because the issue for Europe is always going to be, as it was twice in the last 110 years, whether the democracies hold it together and stave off the autocracies. Right. And I think it's a very bad sign if you start seeing countries in Europe kind of slide over into and I should point out, Meloni in Italy She's literally in a party that is descended from the fascist party with a big capital F. Strangely enough, she is bitterly anti-Russian. She gives Ukraine all the aid she can. She is very supportive of the United States. So maybe things turn out okay, but it isn't what you want. You don't want France, who under Macron does a lot more than it lets on to help Ukraine. You do not want to lose France as a supporter for Ukraine. It's a bad thing.
Well, let's finish up there then and talk about what's happening. Obviously, you're always really dialed into it. Last week, the president of the recently reelected president of Russia appointed his niece as the defense minister, and then he took a trip.
Deputy defense minister, yeah.
And then he took a trip to North Korea to meet his new friend or old friend, Kim Jong-un, I think, to get weapons. And there's a whole bunch more happening, and it seems like the tide of the war may again be frozen or even slightly in Ukraine's favor. Why don't you work your way backwards? Who's got momentum here in the middle of June 2024 in that horrible, horrible war?
So there's a really simple way to decide or to figure out who has momentum. When Putin, as he did in North Korea, makes a statement to the media that if basically he's not allowed to win in Ukraine, he's going to have to nuke the whole world, that's how you know the Russians are in trouble. And Putin going to North Korea and really being treated like a supplicant, really kind of his guys all go into a meeting with Kim Jong-un, and Kim Jong-un is not sitting in the room yet. And on camera, the North Koreans make them all get up and walk out of the room. And then North Koreans went out of their way to underline, you need us, and we're going to make it crawl a little bit. I cannot imagine for Putin that had to feel very good. He went to Vietnam, and the Vietnamese have a lot of warm feelings for the Russians because in the Vietnam War, it was Russia that really supported them, not China. And then they had a war with China. And so Vietnam really feels like they have a policy anyway of hedge constantly, always hedge. So be tight with the Americans, be tight with the Chinese a little bit, be tight with the Russians so that you always have someone to go to help you.
Right.
And I got to tell you, the Vietnamese, they had him, they brought him in and they did their thing. They kept it incredibly low key. And I was just talking to somebody last night who is fairly an expert on Vietnam. And he said it was striking how little it was on TV in Vietnam. So they did their thing. They said, hey, the Russians helped us. We're going to be good to this guy. But they didn't sign a single agreement. They didn't give them a single dollar or a bullet. And they just kind of went, okay, you want to do your tour? Cool. We'll do this. And then we're going to kick you back out of the country. It tells you what trouble the Russians are in. This big offensive, you and I spoke 3-4 months ago. And, you were feeling worried about it. You're seeing New York Times is talking, there's 90,000 Russians, 120,000 Russians. This army outside of Kharkiv, everything else.
Yeah.
And the Russians were able to build up this large force because the U.S. was not allowing the Ukrainians to use their weapons use our long-range attack weapons inside Russia. And the Russians, being the fucking Russians, as always, never took it into account that the U.S. might change the rules of engagement. So they took all their material and all their men and all their supplies and everything else just over the border, and they packed them in nice, tight, efficient camps, thinking we're never going to have to scatter this stuff because the U.S. is never going to change their mind about using their long-range missiles on these camps. Then, of course, Biden changed his mind, and before they knew it, the Ukrainians had utterly smashed their offensive. I'm hearing something like 20,000 Russians dead in the last 30 days.
Wow, in the last 30 days?
Yeah, last month, it's about 20,000. Yeah, so the Russians are unable to generate. They can just incredibly wastefully take a town here or a village there. But for instance, in this current offensive, the Ukrainians are taking all that territory back right now without having mobilized, without having done. The Ukrainians are becoming incredibly efficient at killing Russians, and they're trading some space for killing a lot of the enemy. Who cares if you give up a village? The ground doesn't matter. What matters is destroying the enemy. And that's what the Ukrainians are doing. So it really, from where I see the war right now, the big Russian summer offensive turned out to just be an absolute waste. By the middle of next year, you're going to start to see the Russians run out of armored vehicles, artillery, etc. And if Biden wins, you're going to see another $60 billion or more go to Ukraine. And the Russians are not going to be able to, in the end, match that. So I think that I think this war is heading towards some sort of resolution. Now, if Trump wins the election, he's going to basically cut the Ukrainians off.
Right.
And the Ukrainians are probably going to have to make a deal of some sort. But really, honestly, maybe not. The way the Russians are right now, I think the Russians are stumbling. And I think that they are having the Ukrainians, by the way, today just destroyed an enormous it was a space center in the Soviet Union, and it's able to watch every satellite going out into deep space. It had a whole huge anti-aircraft setup, and it's burning to the ground right now. It's yet another unbelievably irreplaceable and expensive bit of Russian kit that's gone and is never coming back.
You said Soviet Union?
It was under the Soviet Union when it was built. Yeah.
And it was okay. And they just attacked it and destroyed it?
They just destroyed the entire thing today. Yeah. So it's like this. What you're watching is the Russians playing checker and the Ukrainians playing chess. And I think that over time, the Russians just run out. I just think when Putin is talking the way he is, when they're desperately trying to get shells from. Oh, I should point out, by the way, just to give you a sense of how bad their choices are. Putin, to get the shells and the ammunition he needed from North Korea, he had to make a deal that he signed an agreement that if they got into war with South Korea, Russia would come in on North Korea's side.
Right.
Right. You can imagine the reaction of South Korea to that. And the quote that I love, and I'm paraphrasing a little because I don't know it exactly, but the South Korean defense minister said, "We will help the Ukrainians in any way we think that will hurt the Russians the most." That's a formidable country to be screwing with because South Korea has an enormous defense industry, and they probably could pretty much supply the Ukrainians on their own.
Why did you also mention when we were texting earlier this week, you said China just signed onto a railroad project across Central Asia that bypasses Russian territory. I don't know what that's about or why it mattered.
So for Russia to benefit from a very close relationship with China, they want to be the middleman for China to everything to their west. They want to have control, just like the Nord Stream pipeline. They want to have a lever and be able to exchange goods across that link and also to charge for people using it, etc. China is very directly going around Russia to make sure Russia can't do that. And it's kind of amazing. It's such an FU. And Russia always felt that the stands, which were former Soviet republics, are its backyard, its soft underbelly. And China is making no bones about going in there and basically pushing Russia out.
Here it is. I just did a quick search, Newsweek, if that's worth anything anymore. China throws its weight around Russia's backyard. Former Soviet republics in Central Asia finalized a deal to build a railway that will provide China with a trade link to Europe that reduces Beijing's dependency on Russia. After 2 decades of negotiations. Wow.
It's a big kick in the nuts.
The 324-mile railway connecting 3 countries will cost around $8 billion, part of China's global infrastructure development strategy, the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah. So that's the cherry on top of Putin's week, right? That China is making it clear that they don't feel any obligation to help Russia at all, and that it's purely transactional, and they're in charge. And if Russia doesn't like it, tough shit, right?
Wow.
Yeah. So my final point on this is I feel much more optimistic now, and I've never been pessimistic, but I feel more optimistic now than I have all year.
Great.
About the direction of this war. I think this war is going in the right way. It's going in the right direction pretty vehemently.
All right. Well, then I'm going to wrap it up there because that's a great point to end.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, my brother. Have a good week.
I hope to see you at our hangout for the debate party.
I will do my best.
All right, there he goes, Bill Boyle. Go find him on social media, on Twitter, on Blue Sky in D.C. That's all I've got for you on today's show. You bumblebees are the very, very best, listening all the way to the end. I cannot thank you ever enough. So grateful for your friendship, for your support, for listening. I hope you learned as much as I did today and every day. John Carroll taking us out, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.